Welcome to Unfiltered Health, where we dive deep into the real stories, science, and struggles shaping modern health. Your host, Dr. Sean Hall, is an internationally recognized author, medical researcher, and lecturer. Join me as we strip away the noise and explore how chronic illnesses are impacting not just our bodies, but the very fabric of our social and human function. This isn't your typical health talk. Here, it's raw, it's real, and it's time we talk about the hard truths. Ready to rethink health? Let's get started.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Look, if you've heard my other podcasts, you might realize I've just returned from the US, and it's probably really pertinent. We have a general discussion about a rather sensitive topic, obesity. In my book, Disevolution, I contribute obesity to one of the major de-evolutionary diseases of mankind. But I want to be clear, and I want to put this right up front. Obesity is so much more than simply being overweight. It is so much more than that simple body mass index, or, we might use the acronym BMI. And trust me, it's so much more than lifestyle modifications and prescription drugs. In my world, obesity goes hand in hand with other catastrophic diseases and I really want to emphasize this point, is underlined by an uncontrollable inflammatory condition and potential immune disruption. So, obesity is more than just being fat. It's a degenerative and compounding condition that in the vast majority of cases, and hear me on this, was preventable. So in this podcast, we're going to look at obesity. We're going to have a look at some of these comorbidities and in particular, inflammation. But first, medically speaking, let's look at what obesity is. So obesity is classified as a chronic and multifactorial condition characterized by excessive accumulation of body fat. Typically, we use body mass index, this BMIs, with scores of equal to or 30 indicating obesity. And obesity itself is associated with increased risks of metabolic, cardiovascular, and other health conditions. And that is the working definition by the World Health Organization as recent as 2021. When we look at the prevalence of obesity, let's start with the US. I just got back from there. According to the Center of Disease Control, obesity prevalent among adults, and check this number out, and this is 5 years ago, was 42.5%. And this in itself reflects a significant public health challenge that, to date, the US health authorities are failing to address. Jump across the Atlantic and we have a look at the UK. Data from the Health Survey in England indicate an adult obesity prevalence just under 30%. And here, home in Australia, looking at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, again, the data is 5 years old. 31% of Australian adults were classified as obese, right? Numbers are kind of disgusting. When we look at therapies available for obesity, there's heaps. If we just look at lifestyle modifications, and these are dietary changes, physical exercise, behavioral therapy, and you do need lifestyle modifications in treating obesity. There has been varied success from structured programs like, diabetes prevention programs and, things like that have that structured program and that algorithm have shown significant weight reductions and reduction in diabetes risk over time. But the problem with lifestyle modifications, and this is the biggest failure, is sustained weight loss, which means you take it off, you keep it off, right, is a real challenge. With more than 50% of individuals who have undertaken gym workouts, gone on some fad diet, meal plans, and so forth, reporting to regain weight, if not even more, within a 5-year period. And this is partly due to the metabolic adaptations and behavioral factors. So lifestyle modification by itself is not checking all the boxes. High failure rate. When we look at nutraceuticals, and hey, I've just come from the land of marketing hype. I know as a doctor and as a researcher that nutraceuticals like conjugate linoleic acid, green tea extracts, and fiber supplements have, a decent level of science behind it that shows that it can help support healthy weight gain and so forth. So there have been a number of studies that show modest either weight reduction or appetite suppression. There have been other studies that show that nutraceuticals have helped maintain healthy weight loss, right? And helped maintain healthy hormonal balance and helped maintain healthy immune function and also helped to suppress inflammation in the body, right? But, across the nutraceutical spectrum, there are a lot of failures because there is too much marketing hype unless science actually, in most of the formulations that claim some type of weight loss function, in those that have been studied, there is real variability in study design, which then questions efficacy. There's very limited regulatory oversight that allows us to compare data sets from one trial to another. And there is an overexposure to rampant marketing claims that suggest more than it's possible to deliver. Right, so now we jump to pharmaceuticals. And then, wow, where do I start this topic? I think if we just look at some of these approved anti-obesity medications, then things like semaglutide, which people will know as Ozempic, and its counterpart, Wegovy, really do come to mind. And this has brought in all this public opinion around GLP-1 receptor antagonists and so forth. The clinical trials are showing weight loss of up to 15%. In some of the ads on TV, they're pushing those boundaries into the 20s and mid-20s. And it's funny, looking at GLP-1 receptor antagonists, the nutraceutical companies now trying to jump onto the Ozempic bandwagon are looking for supplements that have some supportive or regulatory function in the GLP-1 area. And that's actually hitting the US market quite significantly. When we look at failures in pharmaceuticals, depending on the drug that we're talking about, so this is not particular to the semaglutide category, there have been masked failures, increased side effects, specifically around gastrointestinal distress. There's been health policies written on high costs to patients to access some of these drugs. And even if we look at these newer GLP-1 drugs on the market now, the side effects and the potential warnings are vast. And excuse me, that's my phone ringing in the background. So, to undertake this type of approach really does need specialist advice. But my point in looking at these three areas, lifestyle modification, nutraceutical, and pharmaceuticals, my belief is for weight loss to be sustainable, slow and steady wins the race. And so you're probably, let me rephrase that, you're more than likely looking at a weight loss program that encompasses all three elements to make it sustainable, to make it easier on your body, for you to see goals as you move through your weight loss journey. But at the end of the day, once it's off, to keep it off. New emerging technologies are actually in the area where I've dedicated some 2 decades of my life, is the human gastrointestinal microbiome and modulating this microbiome. It's still very much being researched, and up until I think 2-3 years ago, we were a major contributor in this category. And so this is not a call to arms for everyone to run out and buy their probiotics. We'll come back and touch on this in a little bit more. There's also gene editing technologies like CRISPR holding potential to address genetic predispositions to obesity, but super early, and a lot more work has to be done. And then, the other thing I do want to add here is we now have something called brown adipose tissue activation. So adipose tissue is fat tissue. You have brown and you have white, right? This is specific to brown fat tissue, where drugs enhancing thermogenic activity in brown fat are being explored as novel obesity therapies. And this actually is pretty cool, and there's a lot of merit to the premise behind it. When we look at comorbidities associated with obesity, we can generally divide them into 3 high-risk areas: metabolic, so type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, and so forth. cardiovascular, so let's just generally call that heart health, and then others, so obstructive sleep apnea, certain cancers, and osteoarthritis. And the impact in reducing obesity on these comorbidities is very real because weight reduction, I should say weight gain and weight reduction, have profound effects on type 2 diabetes, right? Where we know that even a 5% weight loss significantly improves glycemic control and reduces medication dependency in these categories. We know that there is a direct relationship with cardiovascular health. Weight loss lowers blood pressure, LDL cholesterol, and inflammation. All in all, reducing cardiovascular risk events. And there is improved quality of life. You should see improved mobility, your ability to move, your ability to sleep. Improved mental health functions are often observed in patients who undergo a weight loss journey and are successful in that journey. But before we get into inflammation, and I'm really holding back from getting into it, I want to touch on something I mentioned before. The human gastrointestinal, or let's just call it gut microbiome. And it's an area I have a lot of experience, some 2 decades. Thinking back on this now, if I was to roll the clock back 10 years and looking at the state of, let's call it the nutraceutical probiotic market, whether in Australia, in the UK, or in the US, who would have thought that gut function has a direct and immediate impact on obesity? So I guess most listeners understand that the microbiome today is a hot topic. I mean, you just have to have a look at all the marketers pushing their probiotic formulations. But if you remove all the hype, what you need to do is know that the gastrointestinal tract, at the end of the day, is a dynamic ecosystem with various bacteria, viruses, fungi, and so forth. Some of these are good and some of these are bad. The point is as in medicine, we really do believe in homeostasis, which means the body works in balance. And when we're sick, we're out of balance, right? So this ecosystem plays a crucial role in regulating that metabolic, that immune, inflammatory, and neurological functions. It's well researched and well accepted. Recent research highlights its involvement in energy balance, so energy homeostasis, fat storage, metabolic diseases, positioning it as a significant factor in obesity, meaning a disruption in your gut ecosystem can result in health out of equilibrium, out of homeostasis, meaning it can result in disease. So in looking at this a little deeper, several mechanisms linking the gut microbiome and obesity coming to mind. One is energy harvesting. So this is certain bacteria can extract more calories from dietary polysaccharides by producing short-chain fatty acids, which we need, we have in the body. So these are things like acetate, butyrate, propionate. Increased short-chain fatty acid production has been linked to higher caloric availability and fat deposits, right? You got that? So energy harvesting is a real thing. Lipogenesis and fat storage. Microbial short-chain fatty acids influence lipogenesis through the activation of specific metabolic pathways, such as G-protein-coupled receptors. And there's a couple of them I'm not going to get into. But at the end of the day, these regulate lipid accumulation in adipose tissue. Gut barrier function and systemic inflammation. And I'm biting my tongue, so I really want to jump into the inflammation part of this talk, but we hold off for a little bit. Disruption in the gut barrier integrity. So increased intestinal permeability, or you might have heard the term leaky gut, allows lipopolysaccharides from gram-negative bacteria, that's bad bacteria, to enter the bloodstream, triggering systemic inflammation. This low-grade inflammation contributes to insulin resistance, which is the hallmark of obesity. Regulation of appetite and satiety. The gut microbiome interacts with the brain-gut axis, modulating the release of satiety-regulated hormones like GLP-1 and peptides YY. Alterations in the microbial composition may impair these signals, promoting overeating. So you start to get an idea on how things like Ozempic work, right? And then there's an impact on fat oxidation. So dysbiosis, so this is an unregulated, unhealthy, dysfunctional gut, can impair mitochondrial function, so basically the battery source of your cells, and fatty acid oxidation, shifting energy utilization towards fat storage as opposed to expenditure. Right? The evidence to support this, unfortunately, is really, really, really compelling. So here and now, understand obesity, inflammation, and the gut microbiome are all intrinsically linked. So right, now let's get to it. Let's talk a little bit more about this underlying problem, inflammation. So, inflammation in obesity is characterized by chronic, low-grade, systemic activation of the immune system, often referred to as meta-inflammation, metabolically driven inflammation. And unlike acute inflammation, which is a short-term protective response to some form of trauma, injury, or infection, chronic inflammation persists over time and contributes to the pathogenesis of obesity and related complications. Full stop. Right? So obesity-induced inflammation arises primarily from excessive adipose tissue expansion, which leads to immune cell infiltration and dysregulated cytokine production. That's your inflammation. This persistent inflammatory state disrupts metabolic and immune homeostasis, that's that balance thing again, linking obesity to a range of diseases. Right, did you get that? So if you want to have a shot at winning the war on obesity, what you really need to do first and foremost is win the war in inflammation. So mechanisms linking obesity to chronic inflammation. One is adipose tissue dysfunction. Right, so where do I start with this one? Hypoxia is an example, right? So when fat sites expand, they outpace angiogenesis, leading to hypoxia, cell stress, and necrosis. These conditions activate inflammatory pathways such as hypoxia-induced factor 1 alpha, triggering pro-inflammatory cytokine release, right? Immune cell infiltration is where adipose tissue in obese individuals attract and activate immune cells, particularly macrophages, shifting their phenotype from anti-inflammatory, which is, what you want in case of trauma, to pro-inflammatory, which is this direct link back to a low-grade, uncontrollable inflammatory cycle in the body, right? And then at the end of the day, these macrophages release cytokines, and we're propagating inflammation again. There's others I can go into in where obesity alters cell expression that results into promoting inflammation, again, across macrophages, across T cells, and so forth. Adiponectin is an interesting one. Reduced in obesity, adiponectin has an anti-inflammatory property, and its a decrease exacerbates inflammation and insulin resistance. So these are adipokine dysregulation, where obesity alters the secretion of adipokine hormones produced by adipose tissue. So that adipose tissue is just not sitting there under the skin, benign. It is leaking stuff that promotes pro-inflammatory cycles in the body, which promotes obesity. We have lipotoxicity, which is excessive lipid accumulation in non-adipose tissues. So we're talking organs, liver, muscles, and so forth. And this causes lipotoxicity, right? Again, it's not a good outcome. And the net result is a release of further inflammatory mediators. And we're getting into this vicious cycle. The last one, again, is the link to the gut microbiome, and it's dysbiosis. Obesity is associated with alterations in the gut microbiota, leading to increased intestinal permeability. So this quote-unquote leaky gut allows bacterial lipopolysaccharides to enter the bloodstream, right, triggering toll-like receptors, specifically LTR4, which is a mediated inflammation. So what I'm trying to point out here is this multifactorial properties of obesity. It starts a very vicious cycle. And this is why we need to be very proactive in reducing the prevalence to obesity, because when these hit for medical treatment, the patient is a confounded patient. They have a multifactorial disorders, and it really does require a very good qualified team in order to address the patient holistically. So I'll touch on quick immune dysfunction in obesity because you're seeing it connected, right? You're seeing that this uncontrolled inflammation is ripping apart the immune system, and this is where we get immune dysfunction. So we have an impaired innate immunity. So obesity itself reduces the functional capacity of innate immune cells, and specifically we're talking about neutrophils and macrophages, impairing their ability to combat infections. So chronic inflammation may also desensitize immune pathways and thus further dampening innate immune responses. We have altered adaptive immunity, right? Where I won't get into this in too much detail. Obesity skews T cell populations, reducing regulatory T cells, which typically would suppress inflammation and thus increases pro-inflammatory T helper cells, and this imbalance further spearheads this downward cycle. And we have vaccine efficacy. So obesity has been linked to reduced vaccine efficiency, and this is basically due to impaired antibody production and T cell responses, right? And, you know, we've seen that in influenza and recently in the COVAX vaccines from a couple of years ago. So when we look at obesity-induced inflammation, some of these systemic impacts include insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease, liver disease, some form of cancers, and neuroinflammation. You got to remember there's still that blood-brain barrier we spoke of in relation to the human gastrointestinal microbiome. If we look at strategies to mitigate inflammation and obesity, they're relatively similar to the same strategies we may undertake to combat obesity. So the top of the pops is lifestyle interventions, right? And here we have the same things we've seen before: weight loss, cleaner diet, and exercise to help reduce the adipose tissue, and thus by doing that, lowering the pro-inflammatory cytokines and thus also improving at the same time immune function. From a nutraceutical point of view, there are some nutraceuticals out there that carry some evidence that show a supportive nature. These would include omega-3 fatty acids, polyphenols, certain fibers, and right here, right now, in some cases, very specific certain probiotics. There's pharmacological approaches as well, from your metformins to your GLP-1s to anti-inflammatory agents such as things like TNF-alpha inhibitors that may be used in combination or by themselves to specifically target a certain part of the body. Specifically on that gut microbiome, certain probiotics, certain prebiotics, evidence is a bit all over the place here, and also fecal transplants have been shown to be very helpful in these areas. Targeted therapies, so specific drugs targeting specific inflammatory pathways, have shown to be helpful as well. So just pause for a sec. Doesn't matter whether you have obesity, you have to treat the inflammation because the two usually go hand in hand, right? At the end of the day, because obesity is a multifactorial problem, your healthcare team is probably multifactorial themselves. So keep that in mind. In summary, obesity is far more than just being fat. It is a grander issue that brings other conditions into play and can really quickly spiral out of control. Know that inflammation is both a driver and a consequence of obesity, and perpetuating immune dysfunction and contributing to a range of systemic diseases. Addressing inflammation through lifestyle changes, pharmacological, nutraceutical therapies, and if you get a chance of being a trial, maybe one of these emerging microbiome-targeted interventions holds promise, because at the end of the day, what we need to do is not target just the obesity or just the inflammation. We need to be targeting both in order to break this very vicious cycle. So before you run off or you fall prey to the next marketer's hoorah on lose weight now, stop, think, start having a qualified conversation with people who know something about this topic. But until next time, remember, it's your life. I'm just hoping you're going to be an active participant. This is Dr. Hall. Till next time, take care.
Thanks for tuning in to Unfiltered Health. I hope today's episode gave you something to think about, because understanding our health means understanding our world. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to share Unfiltered Health with your friends, family, and anyone who cares about getting to the truth behind chronic illnesses and their impact on society. Together, we can break the silence and create a healthier future. See you next time.